Hello everyone, welcome to Watch. On July 4th, diplomatic briefing cited sources saying that on the 3rd, the U.S. government notified General Electric Aviation that it could resume exporting jet engines to China Commercial Aircraft Corporation. Another informed source said that, besides General Electric, at least one other aviation company's export license to China, which was also set to expire on the 3rd, has been lifted as well. Honeywell Aerospace also provides auxiliary power units, tires, braking systems, flight control systems, and navigation systems for the C919. Collins Aerospace, a subsidiary of Raytheon Technologies, also supplies parts for China's Comac aircraft. None of the three companies responded to Reuters' inquiries. Reuters described this as a sign of easing tensions in the U.S.-China trade relationship. This week, the U.S. also lifted restrictions on exporting chip designs to China. The lifting of restrictions on software and chips shows that trade negotiations between the two countries are making progress. Wang Fan, president of the China Foreign Affairs University, told the Mainland's Observer website that this latest partial removal of restrictions by the U.S. is built on the solid foundation of previous China-U.S. economic and trade talks in Geneva and London. He described it as a positive and commendable stage of progress. However, he emphasized that this adjustment is by no means a favor from the U.S. to China. Wang Fan said that this is merely the U.S., to some extent, returning to the principle of mutual benefit and win-win cooperation, which is the right approach. At the same time, he also pointed out that the U.S.'s action should not be interpreted as a concession to China. He said that so-called concessions usually refer to both sides making policy adjustments based on comprehensive considerations, but the previous measures taken by the U.S. were essentially inconsistent with economic and trade rules, unreasonable, and should not have been implemented. Now, canceling those measures is simply returning to the correct approach, so talking about concessions in relation to this U.S. adjustment doesn't make sense. On July 4th, a spokesperson for China's Ministry of Commerce responded. After the China-U.S. economic and trade talks in London, both teams are currently working hard to implement the outcomes of the London framework. The Chinese side is reviewing and approving export license applications for controlled items in accordance with laws and regulations, while the U.S. side has also taken corresponding actions by canceling a series of restrictive measures against China. The relevant situation has already been communicated to the Chinese side. The spokesperson also said that the London framework was hard-won, and that dialogue and cooperation are the right path forward. There is no way out in resorting to deception, coercion, or pressure. We hope the U.S. side will understand the mutually beneficial and win-win nature of China-U.S. economic and trade relations, continue to move forward with China, correct its mistaken practices, and take concrete actions to uphold and implement the consensus reached during the two countries' leaders' phone call. We should work to promote the steady and long-term development of China-U.S. economic and trade relations. Looking at historical experience, during past negotiations, the Trump administration's export policy toward China was often marked by a cycle of tightening and loosening, showing a pattern of unpredictability. Wang Fan believes that this time will be no exception. He said that if the fundamental nature of the U.S.'s tough policy toward China does not undergo a real change, it is still possible that the U.S. will exert unreasonable pressure on China through other means in the future, which would negatively impact China-U.S. relations. Therefore, China still needs to remain vigilant and be well prepared. He pointed out that once the economic ballast of China-U.S. relations no longer exists, the U.S. might adopt new provocative policies against China in the areas of politics and security, which would also affect China-U.S. relations. Looking back at the foundation of over 40 years of continuous cooperation between China and the U.S., it has always been mutual benefit and win-win outcomes. Wang Fan said that without win-win results, the U.S. would not maintain long-term cooperation with China. He emphasized that China is willing to deepen cooperation with the U.S. within a framework of mutual benefit and win-win outcomes. But at the same time, China is also well prepared for all possible scenarios. China's development does not rely on cooperation with any single country. As for the South China Group, according to analyst Rong Ren, the U.S.'s technology export restrictions targeting Chinese aircraft manufacturers may delay the domestic production process of Chinese jet engines in the short term, but any setback will only strengthen China's confidence in self-reliance and self-improvement. On July 4th, Zhang Songluan, a civil aviation worker and industry commentator, told the Mainland Observer Network that the U.S. lifting the sales ban this time was expected. It fully demonstrates the unpredictability and fickleness of the current Trump administration and shows a high degree of uncertainty. This matches earlier predictions that the ban would not last long. Although this round of restrictions has been lifted, the domestic production process of the C919 will continue to move forward. the development of supporting domestically produced engines will also be accelerated. Wang Fan also agreed with this, emphasizing that for China, strategic autonomy and technological independence are directions that must be upheld in the long term and will not be affected by U.S. policy. He also mentioned that China's comprehensive rise will not be smooth sailing, and that only by relying on its own strategic autonomy and accumulation of strength can it succeed, because, after all, no one else is going to beat the drums and cheerfully welcome the full rise of a major power. So what does that mean? China can only rely on itself, but even after China has gained strength, it still hopes to achieve mutual benefit and win-win outcomes. This is the fundamental principle of the Chinese side. Wang Fan believes that the tariff war launched by the Trump administration was, to a large extent, related to domestic political considerations. Trump once thought that by applying tariff pressure, he could win more support and pave the way for the midterm elections and the long-term rule of the Republican Party. But looking at the soaring U.S. national debt, the continuous rise in the prices of everyday consumer goods, and the strong reactions from the American public and industry, it's clear that this approach was obviously a mistake. He believes that the policy adjustments made by the Trump administration were also the result of China sticking to its principles and resolutely fighting back. The U.S. side originally thought that as long as they wielded the tariff stick, China and other countries would be forced to make concessions and accept unreasonable demands. This was another kind of misjudgment. According to Wang Fan, when faced with tariff pressure, China always adhered to the principle of being ready to fight to the end, while keeping the door open for negotiations. He believes that China took a very firm and clear stance. The strategy of meeting strength with strength has achieved very good results. This time, the U.S. side has truly experienced the resilience and determination of the Chinese people, especially when it comes to matters of principle. Wang Fan believes that the current positive signs in China-U.S. relations are worth acknowledging, but there is still some way to go before all unreasonable tariffs are completely removed and the tariff war comes to an end. China still needs to keep watching what the U.S. says and does. In addition, the United States recently announced that it has reached a trade agreement with Vietnam and will impose a 20% tariff on Vietnamese goods. President Trump declared that goods identified as being rerouted through Vietnam will face a 40% tax rate. So-called rerouting usually refers to exporters transferring goods through a third country to evade tariffs. The U.S. has become increasingly concerned about this practice, and Trump administration officials have accused Chinese goods of first being exported to Southeast Asian countries or other third countries. These goods then enter the U.S. with lower tariffs. This is what U.S. officials claim, but there is almost no way to provide concrete, quantifiable evidence or solid proof. At the same time, some analysts have pointed out that the U.S. is actually exaggerating and hyping up the so-called rerouting issue. Mitsubishi UFJ Bank mentioned in a report that if enforcement only targets the most blatant cases of trade diversion, the impact of tariffs from rerouting might actually be limited. What businesses and policymakers are really concerned about is how the U.S.-Vietnam agreement defines rerouting. The South China Morning Post, in a report on July 4, cited analysts saying that the U.S. is doing this with a deeper intention, showing their determination to weaken China's role in the regional supply chain. Su Yu, chief analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit for China, believes that although the specific criteria for defining rerouting are unclear, the U.S. is committed to weakening Vietnam's role as a transit hub for Chinese goods exported to the U.S. At the same time, American media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post have all pointed out that this clause is clearly aimed at China, especially regarding terms related to the price in the U.S.-Vietnam trade agreement. This highlights one of the Trump administration's core objectives in Asia, to suppress trade with China and push China out of the supply chain. However, the South China Morning Post believes that how rerouting is defined is crucial, because the supply chains of Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam are deeply intertwined with China. This means that for Southeast Asian countries, the raw materials for their products mainly come from China, with only part of the production and assembly process completed locally. On July 3, a Chuanjing securities analyst warned in a report that if such goods are also classified as rerouted under the new agreement and subject to higher tariffs, it would open Pandora's box for the entire region, because Asia heavily relies on importing intermediate goods from China and has yet to establish a local industrial ecosystem. The CEO of geopolitical consulting firm APAC Advisors, Oken, said that the Trump administration is basically saying, if you want to continue being America's trading partner, we need to see you address strategic decoupling issues. Now, it's up to countries around the world to decide whether they agree to do this. According to the New York Times, America's approach could potentially push countries that are deeply integrated with China's economy closer into China's embrace. The report notes that many Asian governments are worried about this. How will they respond? Previously, China has already shown a willingness to take countermeasures. Parand, a professor of international business at Thammasat University in Thailand, said that from a political perspective, Southeast Asia needs to act cautiously between these two superpowers. China is a very important economic powerhouse. Not only is it a source of imported goods, but also a source of investment and a destination for exports. For ASEAN countries like Vietnam, they must tread carefully between these two superpowers. Pham Shering, director of economics at the National Economics University in Hanoi, Vietnam, added that this would anger Vietnam's largest trading partner, China. He believes that Vietnam has always remained cautious during negotiations, but now finds itself in a difficult position. To put it simply, the United States cannot tolerate China pulling ahead and wants the whole world to join in suppressing China. However, China will not abandon its path to modernization or its pursuit of becoming a strong nation just because of U.S. pressure. It's really not easy for small and medium-sized countries caught in the middle. On one side, there's pressure from the United States. On the other, if China's interests are harmed, China will inevitably retaliate. Walking a tightrope between the two is a tough challenge, but this is the reality of the great changes happening in the world today. These situations also remind us that the international landscape will change rapidly in the near future, so we must be prepared for all kinds of risks and strengthen our own capabilities.